Human blood and gore dripped from the mangled Iridian corpse, spattering Arthur Wright's boots as he knelt by the butchered alien body without even flinching, causing his disgusted Iridian partner to recoil at the human inspector's robotic lack of emotion towards the gruesome carnage. The dim amber lights of the cramped office flickered as Arthur hunched over his creaky metal desk, reviewing old case files on his scratched and dented tablet computer. A half-empty mug of Iridian sludge coffee, bitter and pungent, sat abandoned at the corner. Arthur looked up as the door hissed open, and Laros strode in, his lean blue form tense, black eyes clouded with concern. "We have another one. Krylos, that scientist, found dead in his lab, body's a wreck." "Where?" Arthur's voice was flat. He stood, tucking the tablet under his arm. Laros winced. "Jorak district, I'll take you." They weaved through the maze-like alleys of the dense alien city. Laros's steps hurried and jumpy. "Can't believe this butchery. It's unheard of for Iridians. We're not like you humans, no offense. This level of violence—" Arthur just grunted, his dark eyes fixed ahead. The lab was silent as a tomb. The stench of blood hung thick and cloying. Krylos lay sprawled on the polished floor amid shattered equipment, his blue skin shredded, vivid purple blood pooling beneath him. Laros stood back, visibly struggling not to retch, as Arthur stepped forward and crouched by the corpse, expression unchanging as he surveyed the horrific damage with clinical detachment. "Your people are too soft," he muttered. "Makes you vulnerable." Arthur probed the gaping wounds with gloved fingers, frowning as he extracted a twisted shard of metal. He held it up, studying it under the harsh light, his jaw clenched. "We've got a serious goddamn problem," he said grimly. "This is a human weapon. Fragment from a Z-27 Ripper combat knife." He stood, fixing Laros with a hard stare. "Killer's human, and if there's a rogue human merc running loose on Iridia, hacking up civilians, then this whole place is about to explode into chaos and bloodshed unless we stop them fast. So suck it up, kid. This just turned into a race against time." Laros stared at him in mute horror as Arthur strode past, boots squelching through the blood and gore. The human inspector's face remained stony and cold as the gravity of the threat sank in. One of his own kind was on a brutal rampage, and if he didn't track them down soon, countless more aliens would die, and the fragile peace between humanity and Iridia would shatter like glass. This was now a battle not just for justice, but for the fate of two species. The harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room cast stark shadows across Jack Simmons's haggard face. The human technician shifted nervously in his seat, his hands trembling as he clasped them tightly on the metal table. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, and his eyes darted around the room, desperately avoiding Arthur's piercing gaze. Arthur sat across from Simmons, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp and focused. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady as he began his questioning. "Mr. Simmons, you worked closely with Dr. Krylos, correct?" Simmons nodded jerkily, his voice quavering as he replied, "Yes, I was his assistant on several projects." Arthur's expression remained impassive as he continued, "And where were you at the time of his murder?" I was at home," Simmons stammered, his eyes flickering to the side. "Alone. I had taken the day off." A flicker of something cold and calculating flashed in Arthur's eyes as he reached into a folder and withdrew a grainy security camera image. He slid it across the table, tapping it with a finger. "Then, how do you explain this? Security footage shows you leaving the lab mere minutes after Krylos's estimated time of death." Simmons's face drained of color as he stared at the damning image. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he shook his head frantically. No, that's not... I didn't..." Arthur leaned back, his voice remaining eerily calm. "You're lying, Mr. Simmons. I suggest you start telling the truth now." Simmons crumpled, burying his face in his hands as a choked sob escaped his throat. Okay, I was there. I had an argument with Krylos about one of our projects. It got heated, and I stormed out. But I swear I didn't kill him. I could never... Behind the one-way mirror, Laros watched the exchange with growing unease. Arthur's cold, emotionless demeanor sent a chill down his spine. The human inspector seemed to be playing a game, his questions precise and calculated, as if he already knew the answers. Suddenly an alarm blared through the station, jolting Laros from his thoughts. He burst into the interrogation room, his face pale. "Arthur, there's been another murder." Arthur stood abruptly, his eyes narrowing. He pointed at Simmons, his voice brooking no argument. "Lock him up, we'll continue this later." The crime scene was a nightmare of blood and gore. Tyros, a Eurydian security guard, lay in a spreading pool of his own vivid purple blood, his throat slashed from ear to ear. Arthur crouched beside the body, his gloved fingers probing the gaping wound with clinical detachment. "Same type of blade as the one used on Krylos," he murmured, his eyes scanning the scene. "Definitely human-made." As Laros watched, Arthur moved around the body, his gaze sharp and searching. Suddenly he paused, his head cocking to the side. He reached out, tracing a finger through a patch of bloody footprints on the floor. "Bootprint," he said quietly, more to himself than to Laros. "Size and tread pattern match human military gear." Laros frowned, leaning in for a closer look. "I don't see—" But Arthur was already moving, pulling out his camera and snapping a series of photos of the faint, bloody prints. His expression remained unreadable, his eyes distant and calculating. Unease prickled at the back of Laros's neck as he watched Arthur work. The human inspector seemed to be operating on a different level, his mind processing the clues in ways Laros couldn't even begin to fathom. Hidden in the shadows of a nearby alley, a figure watched the crime scene with cold, assessing eyes. The dim light glinted off the polished toes of human military boots as the figure shifted, melting back into the darkness and disappearing from view. The morgue was frigid, the chill seeping into Arthur's bones as he and Laros stood over the metal slabs where Krios and Tyros lay, their lifeless bodies a morbid testament to the killer's brutality. The Iridian coroner, a gaunt figure in a stained lab coat, bent over the corpses, his gloved hands probing the gaping wounds with clinical precision. "The cuts are clean, precise," the coroner murmured, his voice flat and emotionless. "Whoever did this knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage. This level of skill, it's not something you see often, not among Iridians at least." Laros shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking to Arthur. "But humans, your military trains for this kind of thing, don't they?" Arthur remained silent, his gaze fixed on the bodies. He studied the wounds, the angle and depth of each cut, his mind whirring with cold calculation. The coroner paused, frowning as he lifted Tyros's limp wrist. "What's this? Some kind of tattoo?" Arthur leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he took in the series of numbers and letters etched into the guard's blue skin. Recognition flickered in his mind, a ghostly echo of a past he'd tried to bury. An old Earth military ID code, one he knew all too well. Laros peered at the tattoo, his brow furrowed. What does it mean? Arthur straightened, his face an expressionless mask. No idea, probably just some personal thing. He turned away, ignoring the skeptical look Laros shot him. The Iridian knew he was holding something back, but Arthur didn't care. Some secrets were better left buried. As they left the morgue, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the hallway. A human woman, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her suit crisp and immaculate. She strode towards them, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "Inspector Wright?" Her voice was cool with an undercurrent of steel. "Sarah Johnson from the Human Embassy. I need to speak with you, now." Arthur met her gaze, his own eyes hard and unyielding. "I'm in the middle of an investigation, Miss Johnson. It'll have to wait." Sarah's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with anger. "You're holding one of our citizens without charge. Jack Simmons. I want to know why." "The investigation is ongoing," Arthur replied coldly. "That's all I can say at this time." He brushed past her, Laros trailing in his wake. Sarah glared after them, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Later, in the solitude of his Spartan apartment, Arthur sat hunched over his desk, the glow of his computer screen casting harsh shadows across his face. He scrolled through a database of human military footwear, his eyes scanning the images with laser focus. There, a match. The partial print from the crime scenes, a perfect fit for a specialized boot worn only by the Ghosts, an elite Black Ops unit so secret most people didn't even know they existed. But Arthur knew he'd been one of them once upon a time. His jaw clenched, the only outward sign of the tension coiling in his gut. Memories flashed through his mind, vivid and unbidden. A younger Arthur, clad in ghost gear, leading his team through the shadows of a hostile compound, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a hunter. The ambush, when it came, was sudden and brutal. Gunfire erupting from all sides, the searing heat of plasma bolts scorching the air. Arthur watched as his teammates fell, one by one, their bodies shredded by the onslaught. And then silence. Arthur, the last one standing, surrounded by a sea of blood and death. In the present, Arthur snapped the case file shut, his face a mask of stone. He knew with cold certainty that the killer was a ghost, one of his own. And he would stop at nothing to bring them down. The next morning, Arthur sat hunched over his desk, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, when his secure comm line buzzed. He frowned, picking it up. A message flashed on the screen, the sender unknown. It requested a meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. No further details. Arthur's instincts screamed trap, but his gut told him this was connected to the case. He had to follow the lead. He strapped on his holster, the weight of his pulse pistol a familiar comfort at his hip, and headed out into the grimy streets. The warehouse loomed before him, a rusting hulk of corrugated metal and shattered windows. Arthur's hand rested on the butt of his concealed weapon as he slipped inside, senses on high alert. Dim light filtered through holes in the roof, casting eerie shadows across the debris-strewn floor. "Been a long time, right?" The voice echoed from the darkness, sending a chill down Arthur's spine. He knew that voice, the one that had haunted his dreams for years. A figure stepped into the light, a ghost from his past. Colonel John Black, his former ghost commander. The man who had taught him to kill without mercy, to follow orders without question. Black looked older, his hair grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes were as cold as ever. "Black," Arthur said, his voice flat. "Should have known you were behind this." Black smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. "You always were a smart one, right? Too smart for your own good." He began to pace, his boots crunching on broken glass. Krayos, Tyros. They were just pawns, expendable. They were working on something big, something that could change the game. A new kind of weapon, one that could give whoever controls it the power to bring the galaxy to its knees. Arthur's mind raced, pieces clicking into place. Simmons, the nervous technician, he must have been working with Black, feeding him information. "And you want this weapon for yourself?" Arthur said, his hand tightening on his gun. Black nodded. "With that kind of power, I could be unstoppable. I could finish what we started all those years ago, bring order to the chaos, and you could be part of it, right, just like old times." For a moment, Arthur wavered. The old thrill of the mission, the rush of power, it called to him like a siren song. But he shook it off, disgusted with himself. He had left that life behind for a reason. "I'm not that man anymore," he said, drawing his weapon. "Stand down, Black, it's over." Black moved faster than Arthur could react, his own gun leaping into his hand. The shot rang out, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Pain exploded in Arthur's shoulder, and he fell, his pistol clattering to the floor. Black stood over him, his eyes glinting with madness. He aimed his gun at Arthur's head, finger tightening on the trigger. The warehouse doors burst open with a crash. Laros charged in, a team of Iridian security forces at his back. They opened fire, plasma bolts sizzling through the air. Black cursed, diving for cover. In the chaos, he vanished into the shadows. Laros rushed to Arthur's side, his face pale as he took in the blood soaking through Arthur's shirt. "Medic!" he shouted, pressing his hands against the wound. As the medics worked on him, Arthur's sleeve rode up, revealing the ghost tattoo on his wrist. Laros froze, realization dawning in his eyes. You're one of them," he whispered. A ghost. Arthur met his gaze, his own eyes hollow. "Not any more," he said through gritted teeth. "But yes, I was." Laros recoiled as if struck. "All this time you knew it was one of your own." "I suspected," Arthur said wearily, "but I couldn't be sure, not until I saw Black." He closed his eyes, the pain and blood loss taking its toll. "I'm sorry, kid, I should have told you, but I couldn't risk the investigation." Laros shook his head, his expression hardening. "We'll talk about this later," he said as the medics loaded Arthur onto a stretcher. "Right now, we need to find Black before he kills again." As the ambulance doors slammed shut, Laros turned to his team, his jaw set with determination. "I want every available unit out there searching," he barked. "We're not stopping until we bring that bastard down, for Krios, for Tyros, and for Arthur. This ends now." Weeks dragged by as Arthur recovered from his wounds, his shoulder healing slowly. Restless energy coursed through him, a burning need to finish what he'd started. Across the city, Laros worked tirelessly, scouring every scrap of data, every whispered rumor, for any sign of Black's whereabouts. Then a breakthrough. A coded transmission intercepted by Iridian intelligence, hinting at a hidden base on a remote barren moon. Arthur and Laros wasted no time, commandeering a sleek Iridian shuttle and blasting off into the inky void of space. The moon loomed before them, a desolate sphere of rock and dust. They set down in a sheltered canyon, the shuttle's engines whining as they cooled. Arthur checked his weapons, his injured arm still stiff, but serviceable. Laros, grim-faced, did the same. They set out across the rugged terrain, picking their way through jagged boulders and yawning crevasses. An eerie stillness hung over the landscape, broken only by the crunch of their boots on loose gravel. As they neared the coordinates from the transmission, a glint of metal caught Arthur's eye. He signaled Laros, and they crept forward, hugging the shadows. There, nestled in the lee of a towering cliff face, was a nondescript hatch set into the rock. The base's exterior was heavily fortified, bristling with sensor arrays and auto-turrets. But Arthur had been trained by the best, and he knew every trick in the Ghost playbook. With a few deft keystrokes on his wrist computer, he hacked the security systems, and the hatch hissed open. Inside, the base was a maze of dimly lit corridors and cavernous chambers hewn from the moon's bedrock. Arthur and Laros moved silently, their weapons at the ready, senses straining for any sign of Black or his men. They didn't have to wait long. As they rounded a corner, a hail of blaster fire erupted from the shadows. Arthur dove for cover, his reflexes taking over as he returned fire. Laros, crouched behind a support pillar, picked off the attackers with precise shots. The firefight was brief but intense, the air thick with the stench of ozone and scorched metal. When the smoke cleared, a dozen Ghost operatives lay dead, their lifeless eyes staring accusingly at Arthur. He pushed down the twinge of guilt, the memories of shared missions and camaraderie. They had made their choice just as he had made his. Deeper they pushed into the heart of the complex, the resistance growing fiercer with every step. But Arthur was relentless, driven by a cold, unshakable sense of purpose. He would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. At last, they reached the final chamber, a vast circular room dominated by a pulsing column of energy. And there, standing before it, was Black, a triumphant sneer on his weathered face. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You never could resist a challenge, could you, right?" Arthur said nothing, his grip tightening on his weapon. Beside him, Laros tensed, ready for action. Black chuckled, a harsh grating sound. "You're too late, you know. The weapon is already primed. With this, I will bring the galaxy to its knees. And you, old friend, will have the privilege of bearing witness." He gestured to the energy column, which thrummed with an ominous hum. "Behold the Psi amplifier. With this device, I can boost my psychic abilities 1,000-fold. I will be able to control minds, bend wills, and crush any who oppose me. Starting with the Iridians." Laros let out a low growl, his fingers tightening on his blaster. But Arthur held up a hand, his eyes never leaving Black's face. "It's over, John," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Stand down and I'll make sure you get a fair trial." Black threw back his head and laughed, a sound tinged with madness. "A trial? You think I fear your justice, right? I am justice. I am order. And you're just a relic of a bygone age, clinging to your outdated notions of morality." With a snarl, he lunged for the Psi amplifier, his hand closing around the activation switch. But Arthur was faster. He fired, the shot searing past Black's head and shattering the device's control panel. Black roared in fury, drawing his own weapon and charging at Arthur. The two men met in a clash of bone and sinew, trading blows with a savagery born of years of pent-up anger and resentment. Arthur, his injured arm hampering his movements, soon found himself on the defensive. Black pressed his advantage, raining down punches and kicks with ruthless efficiency. "You're weak," he spat, slamming his fist into Arthur's gut. "You always were. That's why you left the ghosts. You couldn't handle the hard choices, the necessary evils." Arthur staggered back, his vision swimming. He could feel his strength ebbing, his body betraying him. Black loomed over him, a triumphant sneer on his face. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Arthur saw Laros. The Iridian had seized the Psi amplifier, wrenching it free from its housing. With a look of grim determination, he turned the device on Black. The effect was instantaneous. Black stiffened, his eyes going wide as the full force of Laros's psychic assault slammed into his mind. He screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, as his mental defenses crumbled under the onslaught. Arthur, seizing his chance, lunged forward. His hand closed around the hilt of a fallen ghost's blade, and he plunged it into Black's chest, piercing his heart. Black gasped, his eyes locking onto Arthur's. For a moment the madness seemed to drain away, replaced by a flicker of something almost like respect. "You always were the best of us," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the Psi amplifier. Then, with a final shudder, he went limp, the life fading from his eyes. Arthur slumped back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked up at Laros, who stood over Black's body, the Psi amplifier still clutched in his trembling hands. The Iridian met his gaze, his eyes haunted and hollow. In that moment Arthur saw a reflection of his own pain, his own weariness. They had won. But at what cost? The journey back to Iridia was a blur. Arthur, his wounds tended to by the shuttle's med drones, sat in silence, staring out at the stars. Beside him, Laros was equally subdued, lost in his own dark thoughts. When they landed, they were greeted as heroes. The Iridian Prime Minister himself came to meet them, praising their bravery and selflessness. There were medals, accolades, endless rounds of congratulatory speeches. But Arthur felt nothing. He stood impassively through the ceremonies, his face a mask of stone. Laros, watching him, saw the emptiness in his eyes and felt a chill run down his spine. Later, in the solitude of his apartment, Arthur stared at his reflection in the mirror. The face that looked back at him was haggard and worn, etched with the lines of too many battles, too many losses. He thought of all the lives he had taken, all the blood he had spilled in the name of duty and honor. He had told himself it was necessary, that he was fighting for a greater good. But now, in the harsh light of self-reflection, he wondered if he had lost something essential along the way. His eyes, once so cold and unreadable, now flickered with the faintest hint of emotion, a deep, unending sadness, tinged with the bitter realization of all he had sacrificed, all he had become. He had saved lives, yes, he had brought a killer to justice, but at what cost to his own soul? You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.